My name is Frank Giuliano. I'm a professor here in the Chemical and Physical Sciences Department here at WSU. On behalf of the Chemical and Physical Sciences Department and the Environmental Science Department, I want to thank you for coming tonight. And like all of you, I'm looking forward to gaining some insight on this very important and timely topic. First and foremost, I would like to thank our panel of experts and professionals for agreeing to travel out to Westfield to share their expertise with us tonight. Of course, there are many people involved with ensuring the success of an event like this, and I'd like to express my thanks to several of them right now. John Micklejohn of Voices Rising Together for reaching out to all of our panelists and arranging their participation in tonight's forum. Thank you, John. Teresa Young and Mark Villani and all the folks in Media Services for setting up all the technology tonight. Chef Mary and everyone at Catering Services for that lovely cake out in the lobby that we'll all be snarfing in a few minutes. Joanne Bigelow and Event Management for ensuring that we had all the space that we need. And Mark St. Jean for recording tonight's forum so that we can share it on YouTube later on. People out in the lobby staffing the informational tables also appreciate you stopping by to pick up some information from them. Voices Rising Together, Voter Choice Mass, Climate Action Now, Citizens Climate Lobby, and students from WSU's Environmental Planning Club. The Chemical and Physical Sciences Department and Environmental Science Department have sponsored tonight's forum, and we thank them for their sponsorship as well. And one final note of housekeeping, there's a sign-in sheet available at the voter choice table near the door, near the front door in the lobby for students who are attending for credit tonight. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce our moderator for tonight's forum, Dr. Hilary Sackett, Professor of Economics and Management here at WSU.
Good evening, everybody. I am so excited to be here. It is not often that we get a scientist, an economist, a politician, and a religious leader all in the same room at the same time to talk about climate change. So this is very, very exciting. And I'm honored that my colleagues thought that I was up to the task of moderating tonight. Like Professor Giuliano said, that I teach in the economics department. I am an environmental economist by trade myself, but I think that we'll hear a lot more about that tonight, so I won't bore you yet. So I think tonight, with the way that this forum is going to work, each of our presenters is going to have a little bit of time to present their work and the ideas that they're bringing to the table tonight. And so if you'll just hold your questions to the end, if you have a writing utensil, that would be good, write them down. But we will have 4 different presentations, and then we'll open up for discussion and Q&A. So if you'll just hold your questions to the end, that would be great. So tonight, our first speaker is Dr. Karsten Braun. He's a climate scientist and associate professor here at WSU in the Geography and Regional Planning Department. Dr. Braun's research focuses on the use of glaciers as indicators and records of past and current climate change. His glacier research has taken him to many different parts of the world, including the Canadian Arctic, Venezuela, Peru, Bolivia, and Tanzania. So let's welcome Karsten Braun tonight to give us some science on climate change.
Thank you, Hilary. I'm just gonna grab this mic and the remote and just come downstairs here. So welcome, thank you so much for coming to Westfield State. Welcome to Deborah Auditorium. Thank you for coming, it's beautiful out there, and we really appreciate that you are making the time to join us here. And my task here for the next hour and a half or so is to talk to you about global warming and the science behind it. I'm joking for the hour and a half, right? But it's dangerous to give a professor a microphone. It's always it can take quite a while. So let's get started here. But before we talk about the science of climate change, I want to do a little bit of interactive, active part here. And I want to ask you to look at the beautiful picture in the front. What do you see? Where are we? Can we maybe figure out where we are? Is there maybe a way to think about what this landscape is? Maybe deductive reasoning will get you somewhere. What's not in this picture? What's missing? Yeah, and Does it look like Western Massachusetts? Well, maybe not. It's very, very difficult to see, but I want to see if I can get this. Oh, what I'm going to press. Here we go. I want to see this little, I don't know, it almost looks like a burned out pixel. Where are we? Could be the Arctic. No trees, right? What? The moon? Maybe. We're getting close. Where are we? We are on Mars, exactly, right? And that little speckle there, that's Earth, right? So that's spaceship Earth. That's all we got, people, right? So when we talk about climate change, we talk about global warming, we talk about sustainability, we're talking about this little thing there, right? And we never really see it that way, do we, right? We are on Earth, we're looking around us, and it seems vast, and it seems infinite, it seems huge.
Karsten, use the mic.
Okay, I'll use the mic. It seems huge, right? And so I love this picture. So this is the rover looking back at Earth, right? And I've been showing this picture for a long time, and then the movie came out, and then I thought that's exactly what Mark Watney was looking at. When he was sitting there trying to figure out, using science, right, how to survive on this planet for a certain amount of time, until the rescue came, right? And there's a little bit of an analogy to what's going on here right now. Because we're trying to do the same thing, right? We're trying to figure out how all 8, 9 billion, 10 billion of us can live on this little speckle in a sustainable way so that we can all survive, right? What's the flaw of the analogy? There's no rescue coming, right? So we need to figure out how to do this, and this is of course where science comes in, right? So the simplest definition for science is evidence-based reasoning. So we're trying to understand the Earth using scientific reasoning, using evidence, and the evidence is important here, right? You can believe in anything you want to believe, but you don't believe in global warming, you don't believe in climate change, you don't believe in evolution, you accept the evidence for it. That's the difference, right? Nothing wrong with believing in things, right? But when we talk about science, we talk about things we can test, things for which we can collect evidence, things that we have empirical observations for, right? So that's important to remember when we think about science. So then here is the science of climate change as one slide, which of course is a scary thing to do. So what I did, in addition to that, I brought the much longer scientific consensus with me. All right, so here, folks, I have one of the more recent IPCC reports. So if you want all the details, you can read this. And all I want you to do today is just to at least lift it, right? So I'm going to pass it through the audience so you can lift up the scientific consensus. We'll start with you guys. Here's the scientific consensus. There you go. Right? I also brought some lighter versions if you just want the textbook. We'll pass those out as well. So here's in a very, very, very postage stamp version. This is not even the Cliff Notes. What do we got? Climate change is happening. We know what causes climate change. Humans burning fossil fuels. We know it's impacting the Earth. And we know that the most vulnerable people are impacted the most. And guess what? We have good solutions. And all that, the last bullet, is not based on believing anything. It's based on the laws of physics, evidence, well-established scientific knowledge. We'll talk about the other part there towards the end of the talk. But let's look a little bit at evidence. I won't bore you with a lot of slides like this, but here's one. So, classic scientific slide. We got 0, we got today on the right. We're going back about 1 million years or so, 800,000 years, and we're looking at the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. This is from ice core data from Antarctica. So we can measure the composition of the atmosphere looking at samples of ice. So we can go back in time and say, you know what? CO2, the main greenhouse gas we're talking about, changes naturally. Right? It goes up, it goes down, but it stays, if you will, in what we call a natural range. It really naturally doesn't go above about 300 parts per million. It never drops below about 280 parts per million. And then we can plot where we are today, right? And now it gets a little scary, because we're in this sort of no analog situation here. We're dealing with an Earth that we haven't seen in a long time, right? The composition of the atmosphere is different, certainly, compared to the last 800,000 years. So that's one piece of evidence. So that's the past. Let's go a little bit more into current. Right? So now let's look at today, if you will. Let's look at the last, let's say 150 years, starting 1880. Right? The black line is our measurements, our observations. So we've measured the temperature of the planet. Right? We can do that rather well. And then the red line is our current understanding of what causes that change in temperature that we've measured. And this is a beautiful interactive website from Bloomberg News. I'm not going to actually run the interactive part of it, but you can click on that link. But here's the take-home message. Right? If we want to explain the evidence, we want to explain what has happened, the only way we can do this is if we account for human activities. Sure, the sun has changed. Sure, volcanic eruptions have happened. All of these have impacts on climate, on temperature. But by far the most powerful driver of climate change is humans burning fossil fuels, putting CO2 into the atmosphere, enhancing the greenhouse effect. So that's fine, right? Now, let's go to the future. So we looked at the past, we looked at today, let's go to the future. And here's your classic slide. This is what scientists have been showing the public for decades now. What's the problem with the slide? Right? It's complicated and it's boring. It makes no sense, right? You can actually find this figure in the IPCC report that's floating around. And even if you would find the figure in the report and read the caption, by the way, is a page long, right? So here's our problem, and this is the flaw of scientists like me. We've been trying to communicate the urgency or the importance of this problem to the public using charts like this, and that's not going to happen, right? So we have to, first of all, simplify. Now, simplification is something scientists really hate, right? Because when you do science, you really like to focus on nuances. You like to focus on error bars. You like to focus on uncertainties. But let's forget about this for the next 5 minutes. And just make everything simple, right? So here we go. We got today and we got two futures. And here's, of course, the cool part. We get to choose the future, right? We don't get to choose the black line. The black line has happened. But we collectively, all 9 billion of us, can choose to live in the red future or the yellow future. And that is, very crudely speaking, a best case scenario and a worst case scenario. Right? Future hasn't happened yet, so we can make a choice here. So we can either choose to say, all right, we want to live on a planet that on average is 10 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than today, or if we choose the yellow future, we can say, all right, we're going to live on a planet that's, let's say, 4 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than today. And that's completely meaningless too, because what does that mean? That doesn't mean anything to you, right? If I say, hey, it's going to be 4 degrees warmer on average on the planet, doesn't mean anything, right? So now we have to find a way to talk about this, and the way we now think about it, or the way we communicate it now, maybe more effectively, is to think about consequences. What will the world look like? What will the yellow world look like? What will the red world look like? What will be the impacts? What will be the consequences? Maybe that's more tangible. Maybe that's something we can communicate better. So let's try this out. Before though, we have to make one very, very important statement. And this is, right here, Western Massachusetts, we are not very vulnerable to climate change. In fact, you probably couldn't design a location or a climate that's less vulnerable to climate change. Why is that? Well, first of all, we have a moderate temperature cycle, right? It gets warm in the summer, it gets cold in the winter, but it doesn't get brutally warm in the summer, it doesn't get brutally cold in the winter. We also have, most importantly, we don't have a dry season. So, we here are never really worried about drought so much, certainly not compared to other parts of the country or other parts of the world. Also, certainly Western Mass, Central Mass, we're far enough from the coast. Sea level rise is not going to impact us directly. We also don't have any natural disasters to speak of. Hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, and all that stuff. Sure, we have an occasional tornado, but again, nothing compared to other parts of the country. And we're also rich. Right? So, take-home message here is, when we talk about impacts, when we talk about consequences of climate change, we live in a pretty sheltered part of the world, pretty sheltered part of the country, pretty sheltered part of the state, if you think about Western Massachusetts. But still, we can think about the climate of Massachusetts going into the future. Right? So we can say, all right, let's think about this for our kids and grandkids. And we can sort of migrate Massachusetts down the eastern seaboard and say, all right, depending on what we choose, right? Red future, yellow future, it'll be like South Carolina or Washington, D.C. That's our choice to make by the end of the century, right? So that's one way to think about it. That's the average. Now let's look at extremes. Here's Hartford, really hot days. And all I want you to look at is that days over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. That little inset there. So currently, or historical average is about 2 really, really hot days in Hartford. Yellow future, best case scenario, about a week. Red future, worst case scenario, about a month. Maybe now it becomes a little bit more tangible what these different futures mean for us right here, right? So that's temperature. Now let's look at these two websites. We're not going to run them live, but you can go on these websites here. I have the links down here. So you can type in your city, whatever city you want in the US, and you can see where that city would be at the end of the century, climatologically speaking. So you can kind of take Boston and move it down south and see where it would end up. And you can do the same for the winter, by the way, as well. So you can get a pretty good sense of what the world, or what your neighborhood rather, will look like for your grandchildren and great-grandchildren when they grow up. Right? Again, this is worst case scenario. We could talk sea level. Yeah, it's climate central, and then you just Google 1001 blistering future summers, and I'm happy to send you that PowerPoint, no problem. Another one, like we talk about the sea level, right? Sea level is sort of the big thing, right? And that's something that I'm interested in because in some ways that's what I study indirectly. Glaciers are shrinking, we know that. Glaciers are basically ice cubes, so when they melt, water is produced and water runs into the ocean. The ocean is just one gigantic global bathtub. Sea level rises. We are measuring it, right? Not a problem. Here's our predictions for the end of the century. Again, depending on what future we choose now, we have the dark red future, the light red future, the dark, whatever. We have 4 different futures, right? Again, it's our choice, right? It hasn't happened yet, right? 1 to 3 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century, depending on what we choose. Now again, that's a hard number to sort of think about. Now, what does that mean? Maybe some of you live on the coast, and of course then you have a much better sense of what that means. So let's just try this out and look at Boston. So if somebody can help me orient myself, I think we're looking at, that's Back Bay, right? We're looking across to Charles, to Cambridge. We're basically looking towards the MIT campus. And we're looking at it current plus 5 feet, plus 12 feet, plus 25 feet. Let's try another view of Boston. So here what have we got? We're looking towards the Seaport District, right? The Rose Kennedy Greenway there, that's today. Now let's let the sea level go up 12 feet. 12 feet, does that number ring a bell? Anybody remember when sea level went up 12 feet quite recently? That was Sandy, right? So that was about 12 feet in Manhattan. This is what Boston would have looked like during Sandy. And we can go extreme, we can go 25 feet, right? So, impacts. Now, the cool thing about sea level is we can take this global, right? Because the oceans are bathtubs, so if sea level rises in Boston, it rises everywhere. So we can do the math on that. It's quite straightforward to do. So here we have a global map, if you will, showing you in red the flooded areas if sea level goes up 3 meters. Let's say that's 10 feet approximately, right? So you look at this map and you're like, there's not a heck of a lot of red on this map, right? Does not look all that bad, does it? But what's the problem with this map? There you go, right? It doesn't really matter how many acres get flooded. It's really kind of important if people live there or not. But we also can figure that out. We know where people live, so here we go. We can graph that out. So on the x-axis, we're plotting sea level rise. 1 meter, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then on the y-axis, we're plotting population impacted. So if you go to 10 feet, and you go up and to the left, you realize that about 200 million people are going to be affected by that. And you can take this a step further. That's a little crude what I did here, and I just roughly split it up and said poor regions and rich regions of the world. And now you can get a sense of who is impacted, right? That the vast majority of people impacted live in the poorest parts of the world. And now all of a sudden this conversation that started with greenhouse gases and Arctic ice becomes much broader, and you have to talk about human rights, social justice, global equity as well. So let's try that. Let's think about responsibility versus vulnerability. Right? Mapped out here are carbon emissions per capita at the top, showing you clearly where the responsibility lies, globally speaking. And then at the bottom, vulnerability to climate change, showing you where the vulnerability is located. Right? The pattern is clear, the pattern repeats itself globally, nationally, regionally. Right? Those who contributed least will be impacted the most. That pattern holds true in Westfield, in Massachusetts, in the United States, and globally as well. Here's just one example. Little tiny glacier. Had to show a glacier, right? Chacaltaya Glacier just outside of La Paz. Right? Gone, right? Has disappeared. It's a tiny glacier. What's the problem here? That's the water supply of the city of La Paz. That's where 4 million people live. Right? So if you're the mayor of La Paz, you have a problem coming up. Not right now, there's more glaciers there, so it's not like they're running out of water right now. But if you have to think about water supply systems for 4 million people, that's a problem. That's an impact, that's a consequence. So, back to here, science of climate change. Where is the scientific consensus right now in the room? It's moving around somewhere. Who has the books? Cool. So, that's that. Now let's talk about the other part, that blue box here. Now that's important, or that's something we need to think about. Is climate change an inconvenient truth? Is it a looming global catastrophe? Is it a minor problem we can deal with? Or, as some people frame it, an economic opportunity? Right? There we can have reasonable differences in opinion. Right? Here's our problem. Here's the energy flow chart for the United States. So, this is how we get energy, right? The numbers here are not all that important. Just conveniently, it's almost 100, so we can view this as percentages. Fact of the matter is, in the United States, we're wasting about 66% of all energy. We're only using about 33%. So that's the classic problem, right? And you can draw very similar flowcharts for pretty much any country in the world. Obviously, that's unsustainable. Mark Watney couldn't make it like that on Mars. You cannot waste 66 bucks of every 100 bucks you make. That's not sustainable. But we have solutions. Right? Beautiful study here called the Solutions Project. You can just Google it, straight up, the Solutions Project. Group out of Princeton, or led by an engineer out of Princeton, showing us pathways to become 100% renewable in 32 years. So don't let anybody tell you that we can't solve this, or that we need a bridge fuel, or that we don't have the technology yet, or that we have to wait. Right? Look it up, the Solutions Project. So, I want to end with this slide. Right? And I think this is a nice analogy to where we are. We know, we have figured out the science of climate change. That doesn't mean we know everything. That doesn't mean every puzzle place is in the correct spot. There are still pieces of the puzzle we have to put into the right spot. Right? We might have even misplaced puzzle pieces. Right? But what do we see? Everybody see this? What do we see? It's a tiger, right? Good enough to do something if you see this. So here's the quote from Sherwood Rowland. What's the use of having developed the science well enough to make predictions if in the end we are willing to stand around and wait for them to come true? So that's where we are right now, in the 20-minute version of the science of climate change, right? If you want the full version, the books are moving around. That's all I have. Thank you very much, and I'll hand the mic over.
Thank you, Dr. Braun. I'm so glad that he ended there. This is a great transition to our next speaker. We are here tonight to talk about solutions, to talk about action. And so our next speaker is State Representative Jennifer Benson. She served as the state representative to the 37th Miss Middlesex District since 2009. Currently, she serves as the House Chair of the Joint Committee on State Administration and Regulatory Oversight. During her time in the legislature, she has been a leading supporter of clean energy and climate legislation. This session, she's introduced several important bills that would promote investment in energy efficiency, support local energy investment and grid infrastructure modernization, and establish funds for the promotion of green infrastructure and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Please help me welcome Representative Benson.
So sorry about that. But I am really happy to be here. So, you know, I got, I guess, involved in the environmental movement, or just a believer in the environmental movement, a long, long time ago. I was in college in the early 90s, late 80s, something like that. And I remember other students making fun of me because I would bring my reusable bags to the bookstore to buy my textbooks, and, you know, all these like little things. And so this has been something that's been on my mind for a long time. And then as I got older and had children, and I looked at them and I thought, what are we doing? What are we doing? Well, clearly not a lot. that's good and a lot that is bad. So when I had the opportunity to run for office, or I shouldn't say that, when I took the opportunity to run for office, I thought, now I'm in a position where I can actually do something bigger than myself. I can try to have a positive impact. And although, you know, I've been in there for quite some time, we've done some great things in the Massachusetts House and Senate, but there's so much more to do. And so as we have, and you'll hear some of the history, as we work toward being more aggressive with climate change, and we have been more aggressive than many of our other states in the country, my hope is that we will be leaders not only here in New England, but across the country and even around the world. So what we've been trying to do, and the bill that I filed this session, is a roadmap to putting a price on carbon here in Massachusetts. So that is what I would like to talk about tonight, because I think this is one of the most effective ways that we can get a handle on exactly what we heard about already, so to set the stage really well. So what is carbon pricing? You're going to hear a lot of this. You probably know as much as I do at this point, and you're going to hear even more later on. So I just wanted to say Massachusetts is already doing this on some capacity. We belong to the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. Part of that, it's a cap and trade system, so we are putting a price on carbon in the electrical generation sector of energy usage and generation. So we're already doing this, and we're showing that it works. So moving to the next phase of putting a price on carbon, I would think would not be that big a lift for Massachusetts. We were one of the major spearheads of this initiative. We have attracted lots of other states to come and talk to us and join this initiative. So to me, it's ready. We're ready to move on to the next step. So what is that going to look like? So carbon pricing has been around. So not only have we been doing it here since 2008, but you can see that other parts of the world have been working on this for a long time and showing great results. And the reason this is so important is that we have a body of evidence, and I think that's really important. When we're talking about creating good public policy, we want to use data. We want to use evidence to inform what we decide to do moving forward. So, you know, we're not the only ones talking about doing this. We're not the only ones attracting others to look into doing it along with us. So this is pretty amazing if you think of around the world. I had the great opportunity of going to Bonn in November to the UN climate talks, and this was a very big topic of conversation. Not only nations around the world, cities, states around the world, subnational groups working together in order to address climate change, and many types of carbon pricing was out there and being considered. So I think this is really topical right now. So here's the evidence. The evidence shows that right here in Massachusetts, RGGI has had a major effect on our greenhouse gas emissions, so much so that we've had to up our projections and into the future because we blew past our first benchmark so soon. We've had to adjust the price in that cap and trade scheme much sooner than was anticipated because it was so successful. So we see this body of evidence not only right here in Massachusetts, but in British Columbia as well. So not only is this about just climate change, which is obviously why we're here and a very pressing issue, it's about creating economies and the opportunity to create and expand create new economies and expand existing economies is a pretty amazing thing. And so supporting sort of that future effort here in Massachusetts, our projections show job growth and an increasing employment sector around renewables and energy efficiency will continue to grow as it has been in the last 10 years. We also know public health. This has a big impact in public health. So Harvard University looked at Massachusetts, just Massachusetts, under a carbon pricing scheme, what that would mean for healthcare dollars and lives. And their estimate was that $2.9 billion in healthcare costs would be saved. So we just completed the budget in the House of Representatives. And our budget was just under $41 billion, half of which is healthcare costs alone. So think about that. We talk a lot about saving money around healthcare. If we can make people healthier through environmental changes, we are reducing healthcare costs and improving people's lives. So to me, that sounds like a win-win. So my legislation, there's two bills that are before the legislature. One has been filed in the Senate, mine has been filed in the House. And they have a lot of similarities. Their carbon pricing schedule is the same. The way 80% in my fund, 80% of the money goes back to ratepayers, businesses. In the Senate version, 100% of those funds go back, and that's where these bills diverge. The key to mine, and the reason why I feel very strongly about it, is 20% of this money is reserved in a special fund outside of the general fund of the Commonwealth that would be used toward climate adaptation and renewable energy projects and energy efficiency projects and transportation. So it leverages the fund that we're bringing in through this program in order to further reduce carbon emissions. So not only are we increasing slightly, and that varies, and you'll see as we talk about it, the impact based on income, but so we're curbing behavior, but we're also putting real dollars into systems, projects that will change our future makeup. So in my bill, 80% of the funds go back to the citizens of the Commonwealth, including businesses, and it's weighted by income. And I thought this was very important because certainly, as we heard earlier, those who are the most vulnerable are going to be the most impacted. And we want to make sure we protect them as much as possible, but we also give them some tools to make changes on their own. So to give them a slightly higher rebate puts money in their pocket to maybe put toward new tires for their car to increase their gas mileage, or those small things that maybe some of us take for granted that they don't have the money to do. So it gives them a little more of that rebate in order to make those changes. So businesses also get rebates based on their number of employees. Families get rebates based on the number of people in their household. That's adults and children. Children get a half rebate. So when you start adding all of this up, this makes maybe increasing that gallon of gas price a little bit, a little more palatable, because you're getting some of that money back. And not only that, but it has that sort of behavioral economic approach. So you're curbing behavior by increasing that price at the pump, but you're also sending out a check or some form of rebate with communication exactly what that is, what it's from, and suggestions on what you could do with it. So you have this two bites at the apple with the population. So this 20% green infrastructure fund would really be a grant opportunity. So cities and towns could apply for funds to say, put solar panels on the roof of your school, to make your town hall more energy efficient. I served in local government, and I was a school committee member and chair of a school committee. And we were always talking about ways to save dollars. So if we can give real money back to cities and towns that they can save on energy costs, then that's more money that they can put toward educating students or put another police officer on the street. So it gives towns and cities more control locally. And it saves the city or town from having to expend that capital in the first place. So something as simple as putting new windows in a school is cost prohibitive for most cities and towns. It's just a very expensive proposition. And so each year you're leaking all the time. This might help plug some of those leaks. So we blew through our first benchmark, as I mentioned earlier. We saw gains really rapidly at the beginning. Now the real work starts because we are not going to hit our 2050 targets that we have put on ourselves in legislation unless we do something much bolder than we're doing today. And so sitting and acting and doing nothing is not an option. So what is that going to look like? Well, in my mind, we have options, but to me, if you look at sort of the pros and cons and the job gains, the economy additions that we would see from a carbon pricing scheme like this, makes it a much better option than a simple gas tax, say, which is something that we've relied on for years. So this gives us many more tools in the toolbox to address climate change in a big way. And that's it.
Thank you, Representative Benson. So our next speaker is Dr. Mark Breslow. He has worked on climate policy and advocacy for close to 2 decades. With a background in economics, he became the founding executive director of the Massachusetts Climate Action Network. He's since held 2 positions in the Massachusetts state government as Director of Transportation and Buildings Policy with the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, and Director of the Electric Power Division of the Department of Public Utilities. In 2010, Dr. Breslow was the lead author of the state's Clean Energy and Climate Plan for 2020. Breslow has focused his efforts on carbon pollution pricing during the past few years, and he now serves as the Policy and Research Director for Climate Exchange, which is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to provide policymakers and advocates with the most cutting-edge information on market-based solutions to climate change. Dr. Breslow designed both the Senate and House carbon pricing bills pending in Massachusetts, and he has assisted many other legislative design in other states. Let's welcome Dr. Breslow.
Hi, thank you for having me here tonight. I'm going to be filling in some details from Representative Benson's presentation, which I think gave you all the essentials, so mine will be just adding to that. For a start-off fun one, this is my neighborhood where I live and what it looked like during the most recent big storm. This is how things could look like regularly, and I'm not looking forward to it. My entire basement was flooded, as were most of the homes in the neighborhood, and we're not looking forward to this becoming the way it looks normally. So why do we need carbon pricing? First, as the representative said, we're on track now to meet our requirement for 2020, but only to get us about halfway towards where we need to be to in 2050. And the state really does not have the policies in place to get us there, nor do we know really what they're going to be. Technologically, as the professor said, we know how to get there, but we don't have the policies. To date, most of the cuts that we've made in pollution, carbon dioxide, have been in the electricity sector, with some progress in the heating of buildings, but not as much, and little progress on vehicles. The 2 bills, Representative Benson's bill in the House and the Senate bill, exempt the electricity sector because we've already done a lot there and because we already have the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative that puts a price on carbon in that sector. So these 2 bills focus on transportation and heating, where we've made less progress to date. Why carbon pricing? The price of a product should include the damage to society that it causes. It's a basic principle that you'll find in every economics textbook. In this case, it should include the cost to harm to health and the environment from carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. If you raise the price of fossil fuel-based energy, you give consumers an incentive to shift to energy efficiency and clean energy, and you give producers the incentive to shift toward more clean energy and toward less fossil fuels. A third reason is that if businesses and households are going to invest in energy efficiency and clean energy, they need to know what the cost of fossil fuels is going to be in the future. They need to have a stable idea of how much we're going to add to the cost. And right now they're just guessing what society will do and what future regulations will cost. If we put a price, a specific price per ton of carbon dioxide, and we extend that out into the future, as Representative Benson's bill would do, then they know what it's worth to them to invest in clean energy. 4 years ago, the state had a study done on how you would design a carbon pricing system and what its impacts would be. The study isn't exactly the same as what's in the two bills, but it's close enough to make analogies. So these were the price levels that the study projected per ton of carbon dioxide, and the prices in Rep. Benson's and Senator Barrett's bill are where you would be in this graph by around 2026, and then it keeps going up from there. Those bills go up to $40 a ton, and the bills don't say what would happen after that. So then the economic forecasts are based on these prices. Based on those prices, on the different possibilities of what the prices would be, the model forecasted that we would reduce emissions by somewhere between 15% and 20% from carbon pricing by 2040, which gets us a good way toward the eventual mandate to reach 80%. Doesn't get us all the way there, but it gets us a good way. We will still need other things. It also said that this would be a net job gainer, which I'm sure many of you in the audience are worried about what job you're going to have after you leave here. It's a primary consideration for our society and our state. Actually, doing a carbon charge will bring more jobs principally because fossil fuels are not produced in Massachusetts. They're all imported. Any money that we spend on buying gasoline and heating fuels and electricity, the fuels for electricity, leave the state immediately. The less of them we can use, the more money we keep in the state, and that's money that people can spend on other expenses of life, healthcare, rent, food, etc., which tends more to stay in the state and creates more jobs. And I hope my other economist here will back me up on that. And that's why you see an increase in jobs from these policies. The two bills that are out there in great detail are Rep. Benson's bill and a bill in the Senate. There is now a third bill in the Senate that's being called an omnibus climate bill, which simply means that it contains a lot of different parts to it. Senate 2302, which is in the Senate Ways and Means Committee, and by most political estimates is the most likely bill to actually move right now. It includes carbon pricing in it. It's likely to pass the Senate because it has support from most of the leadership. We need to ensure that carbon pricing stays in that bill as one piece of it. We think it probably will, but we're not sure. So one thing we need is for people to be telling their senators, and particularly the president of the Senate and the chair of the Ways and Means Committee, that we want carbon pricing to stay in that bill and we want it to pass that way in the Senate. This duplicates somewhat what Rep. Benson says in her bill, and similarly for the other older Senate bill, not from the new bill, which has little detail in it. The revenue that comes in from these fees or charges on carbon would go into dedicated funds that go back to households and employers based on the fees paid by each sector. Now, in general, high-income households use more energy than lower-income ones, which means that if, as in Rep. Benson's bill, H. 1826, lower-income households, 1726, sorry, that's a typo. If lower-income households get higher rebates, but they're using less energy, they will, in general, come out ahead. The same is mostly true even if they get equal rebates as in the Senate bill. In contrast, higher income households, because they use more energy, will come out behind. That's the way we wanted it. It's what we thought was fair. It's what's known as progressive in economics, where lower income people need their money more, so we want them to come out ahead. And both bills would do that. We need to make sure that the Senate omnibus bill that's now being considered also does that. It currently doesn't say where the money will go. We are not the only ones doing this. Rep. Benson told you about around the world and in the RGGI states what is being done. Well, right now, carbon pollution pricing in the form of a direct price doesn't exist in any state in the US yet. It does exist elsewhere around the world, but bills have been introduced in most of the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states, all the ones that you see up there. So if we pass this, we'll not be alone. A lot of states are looking to us as a very progressive state to do this first. In fact, the Connecticut and Rhode Island bills specifically say, well, the Rhode Island one, the wording is kind of funny. It says, if we pass a bill, it doesn't go into effect until a neighboring state with a population of at least 5 million also passes such a bill. Now, who could that be? If we pass this, we're likely to be followed by other states, and it's possible someone will do it before us. Washington State, out on the other coast, may well do it before us. They've been working at this for a little bit longer and is likely to have a statewide ballot question. Most of the existing caps on emissions have been just for the electricity sector. But in California, there is economy-wide carbon pricing through a cap right now, which means it applies not only to electricity, but also to buildings and transportation. And California is, of course, huge. It's almost twice as big as any other state in this country. It's larger than many other countries. It has, I think, the 6th or 7th largest economy in the world just by itself. And this system is working well there. And actually, several Canadian provinces have joined into California's system. So there's a lot of evidence that this is working well and can work well in more places. Just a couple of details on the help this would give, how it would assist low and moderate income people. This bar chart shows you, under Rep. Benson's bill, what would happen to the lowest income fifth of the population. So the purple bar on the right is the average carbon fee per household. It's actually in the 3rd year after passage in this bill, when the price is $30 a ton. The middle bar is the average rebate, and the bar on the left is the average net impact, which in this case is the average net gain to low-income households. We specifically designed it that way, and we think that's what's just. This graph, a little more complicated to look at, shows you what happens to each fifth of the population. So the lowest income fifth is on the left end. The average net impact is, again, the left-hand bar, which is green here. So you see for the lowest fifth, it's coming out again more than $200 ahead. The second fifth comes out well ahead. The middle fifth slightly ahead. And then the top 2/5 come out behind. So the next to highest fifth and then the wealthiest fifth I've split into 2 pieces of 10% each. And you can see that the very top 10% by income are the ones who pay the most. And these are all people making over $200,000 a year, so it's really not a big problem for them. And that's it. If you want to learn more from us, go to the campaign, the coalition we're in, or my own organization, Climate Exchange. And there are sign-up sheets out in the hall if you want to sign up on our list. Thank you.
Rounding out our presentations tonight in a very lovely way is the Reverend Dr. Margaret Bullitt Jonas. She serves as the missioner for creation care in the Episcopal Diocese of Western Massachusetts and the Massachusetts Conference of the United Church of Christ. This woman does it all. As an Episcopal priest, she's an author, a retreat leader, and a climate activist. She's organized many Christian and interfaith events about care for the earth, and she leads spiritual retreats in both the US and Canada on spiritual resilience and resistance in the midst of the climate crisis. You can find more of her writings and more about the work she does on her website at revivingcreation.org. But right now, we're very lucky we get to hear directly from her. So if you'll help me welcome the Reverend Dr. Margaret Bullitt Jonas.
Thank you. Well, it's a joy to be here tonight, and I am honored to be speaking alongside these expert colleagues who have addressed the science of climate change, the economic and environmental and societal benefits of carbon pricing. And what I'd like to do in my little bit of time is to pull back the lens and to comment briefly on what I understand to be the larger spiritual and ethical context in which we are holding the conversation tonight. So, I invite you to take a moment and to feel your feet on the ground. Beneath the floor is the earth. So I invite you to let yourself feel the support of the good earth beneath your feet. To feel the sensations of your feet on the floor and to let the good earth hold you up. Feel how solid your body is, as solid as earth. And I invite you now to take a couple of good deep breaths. As you take in the sweet air and let it go, feel the air passing into and out of your lungs. And we may be in a room that has no windows, but even just by sitting here breathing, we are exchanging the elements of life with plants and other green growing things. You are giving the breath of life to trees, and trees are giving the breath of life to you. So we get to enjoy just taking a moment to experience ourselves as a living creature connected in a dynamic and living relationship with the earth and air and all living beings. And as we sit here with our feet on the ground and as we breathe with awareness, maybe we notice that none of us owns our breath. Our breath does not belong to us. It's not like we can hold on to it or save it up for later. We simply receive it freely and then we let it go. So moment by moment, each breath is given to us. Breath by breath, we receive the gift of life. All of it is gift. Everything we see and hear and taste and touch, it's all gift. And this is where amazement springs up, and wonder, and gratefulness, and awe. Here we are tonight. All of us are here tonight, and we are alive, and we are breathing. You know, gratitude is the wellspring of all religious traditions. And from gratitude flows the perception that everything is precious. Everything is sacred. We belong to a sacred mystery that is so much larger than we are. We are part of a much larger whole. In our stressed and busy lives, it is easy to forget that we are part of something greater than ourselves, which is why so many of us, when we feel stressed, so many of us head instinctively outdoors to a place of natural beauty. We come home to ourselves. Maybe we climb a mountain and we get the big view, or maybe we pause in the middle of a busy day and just listen to that spring warbler, or look at that blooming dogwood tree. When we feel our connection, our kinship with other living beings, human and other than human, to me that's what it means to be spiritually awake. We recognize that we are in this together, that all of us are part of one single precious and intricate web of life. And you know, when you perceive the world like this, it elicits in us a certain tenderness. We want to nurture and protect the mysterious gift of inhabiting a living planet. That is the spiritual wisdom we can learn simply from being aware of our feet on the ground and our lungs filling and emptying with air. But you know, our bodies also teach us about the ethical dimension, the justice dimension of the world. The good earth beneath our feet is the same earth that fossil fuel companies are blowing apart by mountaintop removal in order to extract coal. The same earth that is being violently injected with tons of chemicals that crack apart shale, release fracked gas, methane, and poison rivers and streams. The same earth that is flooding in some places and going dry in others and manifesting unpredictable, violent extremes of weather because of the abrupt changes inflicted by global warming. The life-giving air that fills our lungs is the same air into which fossil fuel companies are pouring greenhouse gases as if the atmosphere were an open sewer. The same air that contains more carbon dioxide than it has for millions of years. The same air whose delicate balance is being disrupted and destroyed. Our own bodies connect us to the wounding of the world and to the cries of the poor, who, as we've discussed already, are hit first and hardest by climate change, and who are already suffering from its effects, including extreme storms and rapidly rising seas, food and water shortages, and infectious diseases. So that is the spiritual and ethical context in which I welcome a carbon fee and rebate. Putting a stable, rising, and meaningful price on carbon and distributing the fee in a way that is fair and doesn't harm the poor is an essential step in making a swift and just transition to a clean, renewable energy economy. My friends who, like me, advocate for carbon pricing point out that carbon pricing is not a silver bullet. It's not going to resolve the climate crisis by itself, but it is an essential piece of that jigsaw puzzle. It's one of the most promising tools we have for changing consumers' behavior and reducing our use of dirty energy and creating clean jobs, green jobs, and stabilizing the climate. So bottom line, we need to protect the web of life, which is unraveling before our eyes. We need to move quickly to build a just and sustainable future for our children and our children's children. We need to plant our feet firmly on the earth and to take a good deep breath of air and to press together for a strong and fair and equitable carbon fee and rebate plan. And I hope that Massachusetts will lead the way. Thank you.
I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all 4 of our panelists again. And now we're going to have the opportunity as a community here to engage in a little bit of discussion. But before that, I'm going to tell you the rules. So there are going to be 2 microphones okay, so Frank and John are going to be coming through the audience. So if you have a question, you can raise your hand. I'll point out to somebody to ask a question, and they'll run you a microphone. I'm not running any microphones. I have heels on. I do ask that your questions are questions. None of this, well, my question's actually a statement, so I'm going to cut you off. Okay? Questions are questions. Let's ask questions that lead to some robust discussion. And try to keep them short so we can get in as many as possible. Thank you for doing that for me. So, who wants to get us started off? Who has a question for one of our panelists? So, we're here.
Dr. Breslow, question on the California cap and trade system. It's economy-wide. How is that administered? How does that actually work, just briefly?
Sure. For each sector of the economy, there's a cap on the emissions. So for the electricity sector, for industrial emissions, for heating fuels, and for motor fuels, they fall under a unified cap, which is then allocated to each different type of fuel. And if you're a fuel distributor, which means kind of at the back end of the cycle, so it's not at the gasoline station or at your home, but if you're bringing a tanker truck of fuel from a refinery, whether that's gasoline or diesel fuel, you have to buy permits to sell that fuel. And the permits are actually auctioned off, just the way the permits are auctioned in RGGI. So it's the same system as in RGGI, but in addition to electricity, it's applying to every gallon of gasoline, diesel fuel, heating oil, and unit of natural gas that are sold in the state.
Another question. Over here. Oh, over here? Want to start over here? Okay, excellent.
Is there any benefits to climate change, such as the ability to grow more crops in Canada?
I didn't understand.
What's that? Yeah, so the question was, are there any benefits to global warming, right, in the broadest sense, including, for example, will you be able to grow certain crops in northern latitudes such as Canada, right? And the answer to that is yes and no. I mean, yes, in the sense that certain parts of Canada certainly will now be able to grow certain crops, so they might be one of the net beneficiaries globally of migrating climates, right? So that's certainly the case. The interesting question here is also related to what's called CO2 fertilization. You might hear this argument that CO2 is actually a nutrient, right, a fertilizer. And there are some myths out there that increasing CO2 levels in the atmosphere will actually make plants grow, right? Which doesn't turn out to be correct if you start to look at it in a more complex manner, right? What makes plants grow is a very complicated system. CO2 is only one of the components, right? So in a very narrow sense, yes, there will be winners, quote unquote, in terms of agriculture, livestock possibilities, let's say, in some of the Canadian provinces, but overall, it'll be a negative impact.
Oh, sure, yeah, absolutely, Representative Benson.
So, I'm just going to do it. So I'm going to add to that, though, because right now we're already seeing agricultural economy changes due to climate change. So right here in Massachusetts and in greater New England, we're seeing economies change around maple syrup production, for example. And oysters off the coast of Massachusetts are now kind of going out of our coastal water. So the people who have been fishing those areas are now having to move further and further north. So we're already seeing detrimental impacts here in Massachusetts and in greater New England due to warming of our environment and changing those historic sort of agricultural sectors.
Thank you.
there.
If we didn't lower our levels of carbon, I think they're at 406 or something now, at all, would we have an increase in temperature and sea level, and how much of one?
So the question is, if we were to implement these policies and we actually would gradually reduce our CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere and gradually reduce temperatures, right? Was that the question?
If we can't lower the temperatures, if the carbon level, if it stays where it is now, at the 400 and something parts per million,
Yeah.
how much would the temperature go up from where we are now, and the CO2 level, the sea level? Thank you.
So specific numbers, if we stabilize right now, right? If we were to say, okay, we're going to just stabilize at current temperatures, there's still a significant amount of lag in the system, right? There's a significant amount of unrealized warming that will still happen, even though if we could theoretically stop carbon emissions. I will be honest, I don't know the precise number off the top of my head. How much will it still rise? And how much will sea level go up? I don't know the precise answer to that.
There was a question down here. Yeah.
Hello. I have a question for Representative Benson, I believe. I was wondering if any of the bills account for fossil fuels that move through Massachusetts via pipelines to, say, get exported or move somewhere else. They're not getting consumed, but Massachusetts is benefiting via, having pipelines built, or the economy is, So I was wondering if any of these bills address those fuels.
No. It's really for consumed energy here in Massachusetts.
We have a question over here. Okay.
I'm going to try to ask two, just because I probably won't get a chance to do both. First of all, carbon pricing, first of all, know that I'm totally for this, okay? So carbon pricing creates a further increase in cost, even with rebates given. One of the biggest restrictions for someone like myself, who's not low income, just normal middle income, has been trying to make a shift to renewables is cost. Transportation purchases, if you need a certain kind of vehicle, it's just cost prohibitive. Trying to put solar panels sometimes is still cost prohibitive. So how do we balance these kind of costs? And with that comes the second question, that with this movement toward renewable communities, towards renewables such as solar, we're seeing solar farms going up in a lot of places. Communities, though, and individuals have actually cleared forests to put in solar farms. Shouldn't there be a statewide restriction placed on these kind of changes in land use when you're getting rid of something really important and good to bring in renewables? So costs and forests.
So I'll take a stab at that, I guess. So these are excellent questions, and I'll start with your first question in that how do we weigh sort of the impacts to individuals and weighing out the choice, kind of the choices that need to be made around this. And so one thing I'll say is one of the reasons we structured my bill the way we did was to make sure that low and moderate income earners are protected. So one of the issues that I have heard and we have discussed is if you're front paying those funds, you're still going to hit a wall of ability to pay, even if you're getting rebated. If your finances are tight month to month, those little changes do make a difference. So one of the things we've discussed is having a prebate. So in that first year of implementation, there might be a small amount allocated toward prebating some of those costs in order to hold those sort of income sectors harmless. And that helps you get the ball rolling, so to speak, right? So that's one thing. I think the other thing that we've discussed, and one of the things that my concern has been with the policies that we have in place in Massachusetts, is that it's really not, a lot of the incentive programs, say, for example, are really not approachable by a larger section of communities, because if you can't afford the capital to put solar panels on your house, even if there are finance programs available and that sort of thing, you may not have a single family home. You may not have the ability to finance out those funds. You may not qualify for some of those for other reasons. And similar things for energy efficiency programs and others. So one of the things that we really worked on is how do we help the communities who have not had the opportunity to take advantage of those programs. And a lot of it is multi-unit dwellings. Really aren't covered by most of the programs here in Massachusetts, and so we have made sure that those are prioritized in our bill, along with public housing and others. So there's small tweaks, but they actually make a really big difference. And the reason why isn't just because morally we think this is the right thing. The reason is because in order to make the changes we need to make to meet our 2050 goals, we have to touch everybody. We can't only leave sort of these programs to a select few who can afford it, who have, the right angle of the roof to have solar panels. We really have to dig into previously disenfranchised communities to make sure that we're making inroads everywhere. The other thing is that if we can really do what we hope to do with energy efficiency and renewables and reducing the burden on individuals in getting those things, we are then helping pocketbooks by reducing energy costs moving forward overall, because we're reducing usage. So if you remember in Mark's presentation, one of the reasons that the higher income earners are going to be impacted by this, because often they're using more energy. They're driving more miles, they have larger homes, they're consuming more. So just by virtue of reducing consumption, we are, even with small increases in energy costs, we're still reducing the overall burden of paying for energy. So I hope that sort of answers some of that. And then I have forgotten your second question. Oh, the forest. So yeah, I mean, this is something I struggle with as well, especially I live in a similar area to this. I live in north central Massachusetts. And we still have a lot of opportunity without having to clear large-scale clearance of forests in order to reach our goals. I think the other thing we have to consider is something similar to what we do with conservation land, is we have to look at swaps. And we have to look at if there's a pristine area that we really want to be able to access for renewable production, then we have to look at other areas that we can return to forest to have a net no loss, essentially. And so I think that through regulation will be a big piece of what we're doing moving forward.
Let me just add a bit to that, which is, I'm not up on the details, but I believe the state's Department of Energy Resources is implementing a system for prioritizing where solar panels should go, and the priority is on places where you wouldn't be using up land, and using new land has got lowest priority. And you can see a little bit of that, or at least I can when I drive, where landfills increasingly have them completely covering the landfill, and you see this on the Mass Pike, using land that's already been cleared along the pike.
So we've got a question over here.
Yes, I was wondering what we, and particularly students, can do to help move carbon pricing and to have it passed in Massachusetts.
How about we pass that one to Sarah? We have a member of our audience who can answer that one.
Hey,
Thanks for that leading question. My name's Sarah. I talked to many of you outside. I'm with an organization called Our Climate and the Put a Price on It campaign. And we work nationally, but mostly coastally, with students in Washington, Oregon, and then Massachusetts and Vermont, hiring and compensating students to organize on their campuses and in their towns, specifically around carbon pricing. So if you are inspired by our lovely speakers, I would love to talk more about that. And there are opportunities for this summer, starting in a few weeks, as well as fall and spring semester.
Question here, and then down here, yeah. Yeah. And then, yeah, and then him, this gentleman.
Hello. I'm just wondering how this money that's going to be charged and setting up a bureaucracy to get checks to individual people, having to keep track of income, how much money you make. I've seen a lot of statistics, but not a lot of fuzzy pictures on people working or making changes. I suggest that we stop war and destruction and spending money on that, bring our soldiers home, fix our economies, stop having carbon pollution from all the war machines. A president of Ireland spoke at Mount Holyoke College. He said one of the biggest ways of pollution is the military vehicles that are running all the time. So I have to say, I'm not inspired by hearing this talk because it seems like a bureaucracy, another IRS paperwork boondoggle, and I bet the oil companies like it, cap and trade, they don't mind spending more money to use their oil and gas because they just charge it to us. And prices for gas are going up now. OPEC decided to hold off on production, so prices are going up anyway. So I just don't feel like it's a great idea.
Would anyone on the panel like to speak to kind of like the added levels of bureaucracy potentially in this bill?
Yeah, so this, the revenue coming in would not go to the general fund, would go to the Clean Energy Center, which would have a grant, would fund the grant and rebate programs. And so our projections on sort of the oversight of that are very low. And all of the income information, all of that is already housed in the state through the Department of Revenue. So it's actually not as big a lift as it might sound. But I'll say one more thing, that we have seen wars fought in the past, and the wars of the future will be around natural resources. They'll be around energy, it'll be around water, food sources. We're already seeing this happening. And so, you know, I think for the future peace on the planet, we have to address climate change. It is essential. And so whatever we can do to get there, if you don't like this system, that's fine. But we know we need to do something big. We know we need to put money behind it. And resources are stretched in most economies around the world, but certainly here in Massachusetts. This gives us real dollars, and we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars to put in the first year alone to put toward this issue. We have never invested those kind of dollars in climate change before. This would be record-breaking, unprecedented investment. We can make a big difference, but we have to have the political will to do it. And I will say, I believe this is going to be the most pressing issue facing global crisis and humanitarianism in the world in very short order. So, you know, honestly, this might be part of the solution to all of your topics that you brought up.
I'd love to follow up with a question to the Reverend Doctor on this, because I think that there's a lot of people who are very hesitant to listen to economists and politicians, myself included, right? But you see so many people in so many different contexts, when they come to you and they say, you know, yes, that's nice, climate activism is important, but but we have issues like war, we have issues of immigration, we have women's rights. How do you respond to that? How do you tell them that climate is important?
I think historically, the environmental movement has tended to be more white, privileged, and maybe focusing on iconic images like Save the Polar Bears. So we can kind of think, oh, maybe, okay, climate change is kind of a special interest. You've got your special interest, I've got my special interest. So it's been quite a reframe, I think, for many of us in recent years to realize that actually, climate change is like the big umbrella issue that affects everything that we love. So if you care about polar bears, if you care about the birds, there's so many fewer birds. It's heartbreaking to some of us to notice this spring, so many fewer birds have returned, fewer numbers of individuals and fewer species are returning. Great loss. If you care about birds, if you care about animals, you care about climate change. If you care about war, if you care about resource wars, fighting over water, food, if you care about nuclear war, you care about climate change. If you care about public health, like the spread of infectious diseases, there was a front page article in the New York Times a couple days ago about ticks and mosquitoes and how they're spreading in a warming climate and spreading new diseases we've never seen before. Well, if you care about public health, you care about climate change. If you care about your children and your grandchildren, maybe they don't exist yet, but you sure hope to have them, and you sure hope to give them a habitable world to live in. Well, if you care about them, then you care about climate change. If you love God and your neighbor, you care about climate change. Actually, just if you like to breathe, you care about climate change. I was reading recently that the number of areas in the ocean that have no oxygen because of the oceans are heating up have quadrupled in recent decades. And I can kind of go, okay, well that's just about loss of oxygen in the oceans. That doesn't affect me because I'm a land creature. Well, it turns out that most of our oxygen that we breathe on land, we need it coming from the ocean. So if you care about being a living, breathing, responsible human being, you care about climate change. It's all connected.
Thank you. Question here.
Yes. To the representative, what particular programs or whatever that you're going to use to promote renewables? Because I see some other issues in the state government that actually disincentivize solar panels. The Department of Public Utilities refuses to lift the net metering. The Department of Public Utilities lets the electric companies charge a higher rate for people with solar. And there's various other things right now, which to me are actually disincentives that are keeping the cost of solar up. So is there anything the Senate has or the representative that is going to?
So, and you might be able to weigh in on this too, because having worked in the administration, has a different perspective. But, one of the big issues we have in any of these endeavors is that our electrical grid is controlled by private companies. And so if we were back 40 years ago, when this was all public infrastructure, making these investments, making these changes would be much easier because we wouldn't have to worry about getting permission and ensuring a certain return on investment by utility companies. We could make those investments directly. So that creates a very different, much more complex sort of, and I think inferior way that we can incentivize these areas because we can't just tell a utility provider, you are doing X, Y, and Z. You are investing in an infrastructure that will be more robust and be able to handle more solar projects coming on a circuit, for example. That's their own private infrastructure, and we can't just give them the money or do the investment ourselves. We have to get their buy-in to do it. And that is a fragility in our system, absolutely. But unfortunately, it's not going to change. The state is not going to purchase all of that infrastructure back from all of these private utility companies. And so that is a big issue. I mean, what we've seen is solar projects sort of dying on the vine because, you know, the caps that we've created for or expect these utility providers to meet have been met. We have to raise those caps or eliminate them, but then if we do that, it impacts those who can't put solar on their house, like the lady over here who was speaking earlier. So there's a lot of balancing that has to happen. And so I think, do you want to weigh in on sort of the nuts and bolts behind the decision-making by the administration on this?
Well, a couple of comments. One I would say is you can change some of this legislatively. So the Department of Public Utilities and the utilities themselves make decisions which the legislature can influence. So a big example of that is that the utilities did not used to spend a lot of money on promoting energy efficiency. In 2008, the state legislature and Governor Patrick passed the Green Communities Act, which ordered them to spend what's called all cost-effective money on energy efficiency. Since that time, the amount of money spent has gone up 4 times. We now spend about $700 million a year that comes out really from electric and gas bills on efficiency, which is the most per person of any state in the country, and that money is doing wonderful things. We are substantially reducing use of electricity, natural gas, and fuel oil. So you can make changes to the renewable energy laws in the same way. Second, I would note that we do have a problem with who's running state agencies now. I was, for a time during the Patrick administration, director of the Electric Power Division at the Department of Public Utilities. And at that time, we had a very progressive commission. There's 3 commissioners. The chair was one of my favorite people in the world. The chair of the Department of Public Utilities now, her former job was as the head of the trade association for the electricity generators. So that tells you where her priorities are. Well, I'll leave it to you to guess who appoints the commissioners to the DPU.
This woman in the blue has been so patient. I've seen you over here. Yeah, she's had her hand up. Yeah, she's had her hand up.
Hi, this is a question for Reverend Jones. Jones, sorry.
That's good. That's close enough.
How are you progressing in the workshops that you're doing? I assume in different religious communities. Is there more acceptance of climate change in the religious community as far as accepting that we are in, how can I say this, that it's not just in God's hands to change the world?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, I have the privilege of traveling around. I feel a little bit like Paul Revere, or I don't know what the metaphor would be, but I travel around, and if I'm invited to preach, they know I'm going to be preaching about climate change and how we have to place care for the earth at the center of our moral and spiritual concern. I've had a range of responses. You know, once in a while someone very elaborately stands up and walks out. I'm trying to find ways to preach that appeals to our common humanity and our shared values. So it's because, unfortunately, it's become such a political issue that I think many clergy find it difficult to preach about climate change because they think, oh my God, this is such a political issue. Maybe we can't talk about it. So I'm trying to find other approaches to say, actually, no, this is a human issue. This is a moral, ethical issue. This is an issue. It's an existential issue, and we need to rise to the occasion as people of faith. It just comes to mind, a few weeks ago in March, I helped organize an interfaith witness for climate action, which started on the steps of the State House on Beacon Hill, with singing and praying and very colorful, all just different religions, and then the Buddhists led us in procession with drumming inside the State House, and then we went up to Governor Baker's office and tried to speak. They weren't willing to let us go into his office, but we spoke to him, his staffers, about he could just, with the stroke of a pen, write an executive order directing all state agencies to stop all new construction of fossil fuel infrastructure in the Commonwealth if he wanted to. And then we scattered out to lobby, and I think one of the bills we lobbied for was Representative Benson's bill. I just live in hope that that faith-filled people and people of goodwill, people of will rise up to face this crisis, because in a way the scientific models are wrong. Things have been happening much more quickly than the original models predicted. So the consequences are cascading before us. So it's, as also was pointed out, it's an exciting moment to be alive, where our choices really make a difference about the future that we leave. So sometimes I feel like the best thing we can do is to be a good ancestor. My job is to be a good ancestor for people I will never meet, but I want these people I will never meet to have a habitable world, just as I was born into a habitable world. And that would be a lovely way to spend one's life, giving them that world.
Since I'm holding the mic, and before I pass it on to anyone else, I'm going to ask a question for anyone on the panel. Practical question. If anyone in the audience finds the case for carbon pricing compelling, but is unsure how, as a citizen, to make a difference, to make their voice heard, to join with others, what would be your range of suggestions for those here tonight who would like to become more active in addressing this issue in Massachusetts?
I could start with the university students here. You should take classes. You should take classes about climate change. You should take classes about ecology. You should take classes about economics. You should take classes about politics. Take classes. There are a number of faculty on campus here who are really, really invested in teaching you about the changing world and helping you be the next leaders in it. So seek out those people, seek out those classes. There's lots of opportunities on campus.
I will add to that, take classes in political political science and public policy, because honestly, the scientists have done their job. They've told us exactly what is happening, what will happen. It is now up to the rest of us to use that information to make change. And so, what I always say is call your reps and senators and tell them you support strong climate change policy, and if you are so moved, putting a price on carbon. Because we have the data we need, we just need the political will to do it. And so to me, that is extremely powerful to hear from your constituents that they want something.
I'll jump in with two things. One is, I don't know, but I haven't heard whether this university has divested from fossil fuels. And I think having that conversation, just starting to have that conversation on campus would be a really interesting conversation, to start talking about the climate crisis and how do we align our investments with the world we want to be creating. So I would encourage that conversation to get going here on campus. And secondly, I would invite everyone to start thinking about from what spiritual resources do you draw to stay strong and creative? Because I think a lot of people when they start hearing the scientific facts and they start realizing, what a challenging situation we're in. A lot of people either go into panic mode and run around getting frantically busy and anxious, or they go into shutdown mode. And it's like, I can't deal with that. I'm just one person. I'm not an expert. I can't make a difference. So I think it's really important that each of us find ways to be spiritually resilient, to find a path that practices, I don't care what religion you belong to, but to find practices and a community where you can tap into your deepest wisdom. There was the metaphor at the beginning about, if you were trapped on Mars, maybe someone would come and rescue you. And this is a situation where there's no one from the outside who's going to come and rescue us. So I don't believe in sort of an external God who's going to come and rescue us. But I do believe that we have resources within us that we are only barely conscious of. So in a way, you can imagine the climate crisis as a catalyst for a change of consciousness, where we begin to realize that actually we belong to each other, we are all part of one sacred whole, and to find practices and a community that help us reach into that truth. So I don't know whether we're going to be successful or not. Are we going to save life on this planet? Are we going to save human civilization? I don't know. All I know is that when I get up in the morning, I want to live true to who I was created to be, which is someone who's a blessing on earth rather than some alternative. So I invite you to have that conversation with yourself and maybe do some exploring of spiritual paths.
Other questions? Yeah.
I have a comment and a real question. The comment I have relates to what this young lady said and what the Reverend Doctor said about spiritualism and ethics and morality. And I would say that unless you address the problem of an economic system, an immoral, unethical economic system that is driven to produce maximum profit and maximum growth for a handful of investors, and thus drives a lot of the activity that creates carbon, you're not going to be able to address the problem as effectively as possible. So you do have to address the problem of the system itself. That's my comment. My question is, the bill is punitive to those industries that put carbon into the atmosphere. Is there a benefit to industries and technologies that proactively take carbon out of the atmosphere and sequester it permanently?
There's not a direct mechanism for that in the bill. I don't know if you see an indirect sort of benefit.
Well, if you were a company that's producing emissions and then managing to sequester them, then you would not be paying fees on those emissions. The bill specifically says if you're sequestering your own emissions, then you don't have to pay on it. So it would help those companies. But if there isn't a provision now that would say if you're a company that's helping to sequester for somebody else, but I suppose there's nothing in the bill that blocks a company that's producing emissions from paying someone else to sequester them for them, in which case they'd save money, so you could do that kind of a transaction.
And I'll just briefly, and as a business here in Massachusetts, you're still getting rebates based on your number of employees. So if you are sequestering your carbon and not paying the carbon price, you're still receiving the rebates. So there's still a benefit to you, if not a direct incentive for that sequestration. So I will say that there's nothing in the bill that says the only types of energy production or whatever has to be solar or wind. The granting out is really, so say a municipality decides to go along a route. So this does not assume any kind of future technology. It really is based on efficiency. So reducing carbon emission and efficiency. And so funding can go toward companies doing that work, as well as it can go to a company putting in solar panels. So it's blind as far as how you go about it. The interest is in reducing carbon. So how you reduce carbon is the issue, because we do not want to prevent future technological advances, for sure. So it doesn't dictate one over the other. It's completely blind to that.
There's a question over here.
I just wanted to answer the question about other ways of being involved in helping carbon pricing get passed in Massachusetts. The organization that put on this seminar is called Voices Rising, and there are sign-up sheets outside if you are interested in that. I belong to Climate Action Now, and we have a group that works solely on carbon pricing. And if you look up Climate Action Now, you can go to our carbon pricing page, and my contact information is there, and you can also sign up for our newsletters. So that's another way to get involved.
Thank you so much for that. There's a question back here.
Thank you. This is a question for Representative Benson. So when we call our individual representatives, what do we say? What exactly do we say?
You know, I would say simply you support putting a price on carbon because you are concerned about climate change. I mean, it can be very simple. Really what you want is to be logged into their system as being a supporter of robust policies around climate change. And so, you know, we want to shift the balance of indifference. And I think that's our biggest, you know, there is a big issue politically with people who don't believe in climate change. And I know even in Massachusetts, this is true. I have constituents who literally email me the temperature readout on their thermometer in their house as proof that global warming is not a thing. So there is a small population in Massachusetts who is there. And of course, nationally, this is an issue. But really, I think our biggest threat is indifference. And so just by making that phone call, sending that email, getting on their radar as someone who cares, those numbers start to add up. And that's really going to shift the focus. Because, you know, I know people say horrible things about politicians, but in fact, we're actually human beings. And, you know, there's only so much we can focus on a day-to-day basis. And so the things that rise to the top are the things that we're hearing from our districts about. And so you want your issue to rise to the top.
I'd like to ask a question real quick, though, of something we haven't touched on, which is like so much, which is business. And maybe this is a question for you, Dr. Breslow. But in your report, you mentioned that, you know, the overall macroeconomic impact is small and in general a net gain, with the exception of several sectors, right? One of those being construction and manufacturing. So what kind of pushback do you foresee coming from these industrial sectors, and do you think we can get businesses on board?
Yes, so we actually haven't gotten pushback yet, except for the fossil fuel industries themselves, the American Petroleum Institute and the Fuel Oil Dealers Association. But I would anticipate getting it from the two sectors you said. So part of the answer is that the bills do specifically give the state the authority to target more rebates to heavily impacted industries, and that includes the two you said. Mm-hmm. So we expect that more money would go toward them. And more so manufacturing is the concern, because construction, although they're going to be paying a lot of fees, we don't really anticipate that someone's going to choose to, say, build an office tower in Rhode Island rather than Massachusetts because their energy costs have gone up so much. People really choose based on location. So we don't think the construction industry is going to have a lot of trouble. Manufacturing is in tighter competition. And so we do expect that some manufacturing sectors will be particularly concerned, and we do need to make sure that they can see that they're getting those rebates.
Another question here? And then,
I'll
how
just
are we doing
quickly-
on time, real quick? Are we good on, we're okay? Okay.
I'll just quickly add to that, though, in construction industry, a lot of labor organizations are very interested in this, and many have come out in support of my bill because they see this as investing in new technologies and renewables and actually puts more work in front of their members.
Earth's population is going from 7 billion to 11 billion by the end of the century, and meat eating is also a factor. So how do those impact global warming and carbon pricing?
I think Rep. Benson may not have seen the sentence I put in her bill saying that we're going to have a one-child policy in Massachusetts.
I broke that already.
Do you want to speak to population and how it would?
Oh, population?
Yeah, population growth.
Sorry, yep. Yeah, so population growth is an issue, right? I mean, that's what we're seeing in the rapidly developing countries like China, India. Population growth, more people, more needs. There's a very simple solution to population growth, right? We can do this, and this is called women's rights, empowering women to make their own choices about their own bodies and their own health. And that drops population growth. So there's a very simple, very ethical way to support or to work against issues of population rise. Meat is an issue. There's no question about it. If you eat meat, you are that's bad for the environment. That's a fact. The numbers are clear. And how do you make a choice on that? Well, we live in a democracy where you can make your own choices. And we're not, and that's a great thing, right? But yeah, I mean, one of the most beneficial things would be to reduce meat consumption on the planet.
I just wanted to quickly address your question. If you see the Clean Energy Future Massachusetts campaign, right now we're in a month of action. It was a week of action, but it got extended to a month of action. And part of that is a phone call and letter drive to representatives and senators. And if you go to the website, you can find scripts there that you can literally just plug in your name and your representative, and you can just read out exactly what it says. There's also great websites if you don't know how to reach your rep or senator. You can go to Find My Legislator and the Massachusetts government website and find that really easily.
You have a question in the back?
Yes. On your bill, Senator Benson, you have withheld 20%, as you said, for some granting. From what I'm hearing so far tonight, that granting is for corporations. Is it also possibly for individual families who can get financing for solar panels or for help with purchasing an electric vehicle, or is it only for corporations?
It's actually not at all for corporations. It's really aimed at organizations and municipal entities primarily is what we've initially talked about. So your city and town, a regional school district, a region of cities and towns, a county, regional transportation. So it's really more geared toward larger scale projects, and like I said, public housing and sort of that area. It's not to individuals or individual families. That's not to say that through a regulatory process that could be added in the future, but we have to look at large scale carbon reduction. And so we can do that through sort of these larger scale projects in the outset. If you look kind of off into the future, if we've maximized those benefits, that grant might change.
So my question's for Representative Benson, and you spoke to it briefly. Your plan has some money set aside for regional transportation. Does that help to offset the incurred cost, or I guess the cost of gasoline increases, so it's not incurred by users who tend to be lower income?
Yeah, well, so this isn't guaranteeing money for all regional transportation agencies across the Commonwealth. So currently in the bill, it's a grant program. So if it really would be more toward developing new transportation options within cities, towns, regions, say like shuttle services and that sort of thing. What we're also seeing is sort of that last mile issue from connecting commuter rails to, businesses out and a reverse commute, for example, right? So none of this is written in stone in the bill. And it's fairly broad how these grants can go out. But I will say that in addition to the income weighting of the rebates, there is also geographic weighting in there as well, because my concern is if you live in an area like I do and like you do here, that you don't have a lot of access to public transportation options and you have farther to drive for regular daily activities like going to the supermarket, you're going to be unfairly burdened by this. And so there's actually a 30% increase in the rebate for people living in more rural areas who have less access to public transportation options. So it's kind of gets to what you're talking about, but kind of in a different way.
Great question from one of my students. So we're going to wrap up, but I want to make sure that I give the panelists one more opportunity. If you have anything else that you'd like to add, or now that we've had some discussion or something, anything you'd like to share with the audience before we finish tonight.
Please contact your own state representative if you know who they are, and tell them you want this to pass.
Well, just because of who I am and I come at things from my sort of spiritual, ethical perspective, I'd say I hope we can match our commitment to the outer landscape with our commitment to the inner landscape, so that as we push for carbon pricing and take all the actions we can to heal the earth and to stabilize climate disruption, we can also learn all the skills of how to manage our own emotional responses and tap into our deep resources of creativity and especially of love. It's all about love.
I think that's a great, great lesson to end on. So let's thank our panelists one more time.
And their moderator.
Thank you all for coming tonight.